Before I start, I want to say two caveats. And I guess the first one is about my expectation of you guys during this conversation. And my expectation of you guys is that you listen not just with your brains, but with your hearts a little bit. Allow yourself to go there along this story with me emotionally, even if that emotion is like, oh, I don't like this. Even if it's like, because we're going to talk about my organization, which was a little controversial. Not everyone loved it, and a lot of you in this room, I don't know what your experience was, and if it's negative, it's okay. So I guess allow yourself to go there emotionally. And then the second major caveat is this fundamentally is a presentation around my learnings and principles of creating a social movement, more than it is just a conversation around social filmmaking or media. And what I mean by that is this: if the analogy of life is a forest, or an ecosystem, certain people feel driven to remove the weeds from that. And that's what our story was, to remove what kind of the one specific problem in our ecosystem, which was Joseph KONY and the LRA. Other people feel called to plant a tree, and plant something positive. And then other people feel inspired to work on the nutrients of the soil. These are storytellers that make very powerful films that don't end with a call to action. They don't end with the three things you need to do right now, okay? I submit that all of those are valid, right? And all of those are important, and we need all of those. This, though, fundamentally is a conversation around what does it take to create a social movement. The reason that I'm standing here and the reason that Invisible Children existed is because of this man on the left, Joseph KONY, leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, and their tactic was the forceful recruitment and abduction of children to become child soldiers. Over time, if you followed the story of East Africa, the LRA actually started as a somewhat popular rebellion against an oppressive government. They were an oppressed minority. But over time, I'm not going to go through the history of the conflict, but over time, you can simplify it to Joseph KONY lost the support of the people that he was claiming to protect and then turned on them. That is why they forcefully abducted kids, because no one was joining this army voluntarily, right? And so what the effect of this was an entire community living in abject fear of this rebel group that was preying on their kids. So children en masse would leave their homes at night to move to sleep in downtown city centers, such as this photo here. And then families clustered together in these massive internally displaced communities, the number of 1.8 million people. This is late 90s, early 2000s. In 2003, the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs calling it the most neglected and forgotten humanitarian emergency in the world. In the world, okay? That same month, actually the day that the war in Iraq started, these three gentlemen, Jason Russell on the left, Bobby Bailey in the middle, Laren Poole on the right, the three founders of Invisible Children, got on a plane to head to Sudan. And as you heard from the introductions, Jason very much inspired by Dan and his journals and the power of media, the power of storytelling, the power of just looking at a problem in the face, capturing it with humanity, and then sharing that story. They went to document this horrific situation. They brought that footage back to San Diego to create this 50-minute documentary film originally called Invisible Children. So before we were an organization, we were a film. The very first slide of this film, which is again why it's so fun and such an honor to stand here, the very first slide of this documentary film was this quote: "Once one has been to these challenging and terrible places, they are always strangely drawn back, because there's nothing that can compare to seeing the raw reality of the basic human need for survival. It disgusts and it inspires." Dan. The first words that Invisible Children ever put into the world were words from your brother and Kathy's son. It's pretty special. And the film went on to be amazing, and we did what any filmmaker would do back 10 years ago, before YouTube exists, before Facebook, before Netflix. There was really only one way to get a film out to the world. That was film festivals. So we submitted it to Sundance, and then boom, got rejected, right? So the initial, the initial, the plan completely failed. And that's when our founders, who were stubborn, as you will see in the presentation, started recruiting their friends and family of which I was one of them. So at the time, this was my life. This is my prized possession. It's my key card to my first big old important job at JP Morgan in Century City, actually on Avenue of the Stars here in LA. And that was what I wanted to be. You know, there's that old saying that goes, people who want to be successful but don't know what they care about go into investment banking. That's who I was. I was a smart kid, went to UCLA, studied applied math, management, and accounting. Had never been out of the country other than like England on a band trip, a marching band, not like not like a cool band, like the trombone band. So you know, I had no background, no experience, but I was organized. And my friend that I grew up with, Laren, one of the founders, said, "Ben, I really think you should help us start this organization." You know, it takes guts to ask a friend to quit a job like JP Morgan to work for free for a nonprofit startup. But thankfully I said yes, because our plan was, again, not being able to go to film festivals, not having any other distribution. We launched Invisible Children like you would launch a real grassroots rock band, like a cool one. And that was to get money from a foundation that got us this fleet of 15 old used 15-seater vans, and fill those vans with good-hearted college students that we called roadies, in teams of 3 or 4, that we assigned to a portion of the country. So like think Team California, Team Texas, Team Florida, and then brought those kids, teaching them how to cold call. How do you cold call a school? And after only 1 month of training, we sent those people that were the freshest, newest recruits to the organization, after a little goodbye send-off ceremony on the road to do screenings like this. To do screening after screening after screening, and on this first tour alone, we did about 800 physical screenings. This was the way, again, in 2006, that Invisible Children introduced itself to the country. Not in the media, but in small community rooms and churches and high schools and colleges. And why I started here, this presentation is going to spend a lot of time talking about the KONY 2012 campaign that most people know about, Invisible Children. I'm starting here because this is the reason that we had the potential to launch that campaign. I call these screenings a transformative experience because, like, if I was like an engagement expert, like McKinsey person, they talk a lot about like the different audiences that you can pursue. Right? This is classic sales, right? You have your easiest audience to get more involved is the people that are already involved, right? Taking engaged to super engaged, right? This is how do you get, a new donor, you go to the ones that have donated in the past and you ask them for more. So engaged to super engaged, that's the easiest audience. The second is the unengaged, but whose like worldview is aligned, right? So they're not involved in your cause, but if you polled them, they kind of believe in it, right? And then the third group is unengaged and somewhat hostile. So that could be, in our case, people that don't think there's a role for Americans to work on an issue in Africa, right? For whatever reason. There's problems in your own backyard, or there's like racist people or whatnot, or in the environmental movement, you have a very strong group in category number 3, people who don't believe that that's a problem or don't. And I think most organizations, especially nonprofits, most nonprofits especially, really struggle to get outside of camp number 1, right? Struggle to even get outside of preaching to the choir, to try to just, yell at the people that are already engaged to do more, right? Maybe they bleed into part 2, people that aren't engaged but that are open to it. Very rarely can they even touch part 3. I submit that our screenings and what we did here in these high schools really hit all 3 of those categories. Mostly, actually, that's actually not even true. I don't know if we had a first category because we didn't exist. There weren't we didn't tap into like the, young people for human rights community. We kind of created it, and I think what it takes to create an experience that leads to hitting people in categories 2 and 3, which I believe is extremely important, is some of these ingredients. 1, a captive audience, a group that didn't self-select in, right? A group that didn't choose to be there. I see this all the time now with, there's so many incredible documentary films, and there's incredible documentary film festivals, but the people in the room generally are already engaged. You don't have to convince them, right? You have to go to places like, again, what we found with schools, where you're getting the captain of the football team and the angsty, cynical young person that wouldn't want to be there, but they had to be there. Within a character-driven story, again, leading not with the stats of why something's wrong, but talking to you about a person. All of our films, that first one introduced you to an individual. Actually, most of our films introduced you to this specific kid named Jacob. I think he was the star of like 6 of our different films. You got to know him as a person. You didn't get to know the issue. You didn't get to know what he was a victim of. You got to know him, okay? Talked to you by a peer messenger. The roadies were around your age. They were around your social economic status, right? We weren't sending Angelina Jolie on tour to high schools with Angelina Jolie asking you to be involved. We were sending kids that were broke but were volunteers saying, I'm working here for free. I'm 2 years older than you. I'm dedicating my life to this. Will you join me? They were saying that face to face with a direct call to action and then a perfect environment for follow-up. That last one I think is even more, maybe the most important. I know Participant Productions, here in LA is making great films that are very, socially conscious, but you're seeing those in an environment with 200 strangers. No one stands up after The Cove played at the AMC in Santa Monica and says, what are we, AMC Santa Monica people, going to do about this, right? There's no way that you can do that. Well, in a school you can. What are we, Wilson High School, going to do about this?